Well, it's really great to see everyone here. We were just saying, excited to see that people are excited about regulations or to learn about them. And I think it's also just something we have to deal with. So, thank you for taking time out of your day to be here. I'm Alicia Badworth. I'm the coordinator of the California Food Hub Network, and I'm joined by McKenna Hayes today, who's going to be leading the training. If you could put your Food Hub name and location in the chat and then rename yourself on Zoom with your name and then your affiliation. Um, and this training is going to be from 12 to 1:30, and I'm recording the training. But we will stop recording after McKenna's presentation and before the Q&A so we can have kind of a frank and candid back and forth about regulations. I'm going to do a quick intro and then pass it off to McKenna to lead the training. And then at the end, I'm going to ask you to complete an evaluation so we can track our impact. We are funded by the Southwest Regional Food Business Center, which supports resilient, diverse, and competitive local and regional food systems by improving opportunities for food and farm businesses across Arizona, California, Nevada, and Utah. Funding for this program was terminated, but we're able to carry out these Food Hub regulatory compliance trainings with support from the Southwest Regional Food Business Center. Can you go to the next slide?
Mhm.
The California Food Hub Network is a program of the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, or UC SAREP. SAREP is a statewide program of the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources. SAREP's work across the food supply chain supports agriculture and food systems that are economically viable, conserve natural resources and biodiversity, and enhance the quality of life and equity in the state's urban, rural, and tribal communities. Next slide. And welcome everyone. I still see there's a few people filtering in. I'm just doing a quick introduction and I'll pass it off to McKenna to start the training. So just about the California Food Hub Network, most of you are involved, but for those of you who aren't, the Food Hub Network is a learning network to coordinate TA, collaborative learning, and information sharing for and among food hubs in California. UC SAREP operates a listserv for the California Food Hub Network, which is used to share upcoming events, funding opportunities, and the exchange of best practices between food hub operators. The listserv is comprised of California Food Hub operators and organizations that support food hubs with technical assistance and market access. We also have a Find a Food Hub map on our website, and a lot of you have opted into that. If your food hub is not on the map, then there's a form you can fill out to add it. And I'll share some links once I go off my speaking. Next
Hey, there I
slide.
am.
On mute.
And so I'd already introduced the listserv. If you're not on the listserv and you would like to be, there's a form and a QR code here to join. Next slide. The last thing I wanted to plug is the California Food Hub Network Resource Library. This is maintained by Christina Harrington at the California Department of Food and Agriculture. And she has been great about updating upcoming events and funding opportunities and resources that are relevant to food hubs. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to pass it off to McKenna. She has a lot to cover today, and we're really excited to have her here. She's been working with some of the food hubs in the California Food Hub Network directly, and she'll also be leading these next series of trainings for the Food Hub Network. Sorry. And so about McKenna. So McKenna is the director of Food Connect's Food Hub in Vermont. She has worked as a food hub operator for over 10 years in various sectors of the food, retail, and sustainable food and farming industry for over 15 years. McKenna holds a master's degree from the Vermont Law School in Food and Agriculture Law and Policy and has a knack for translating regulatory language into food hub speak. And so without further ado, I'll pass it off to you, McKenna.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I know how busy it is to be a food hub operator, so that is very cool that you're all here to learn about FSMA. And hopefully you're excited about it, but also you need to learn about it. And I'm so happy to help with that. So yeah, all those things Alicia said about me, totally on track. I've been a food hub operator for a really long time, and then worked in food systems for a really long time. Um, One thing I am not is a lawyer or an agency employee or an inspector or an auditor. So I want to be really clear about that I'm coming to you with this information from the perspective of a food hub operator that randomly also knows a lot about regulations, and those two things interconnected really early on in my career as a food hub operator. So I've always been thinking a lot about regulations and how to have food safety and all the things that tie into a compliance program as part of our operation at Food Connects. So, legally, I have to say, I am not giving you legal advice. I am not a lawyer. So let's just be super clear about that. And I'm okay with that because I think we need more food hub operators in some of these conversations to help bridge that gap of like what this regulation means on paper and how we realistically implement things in our food hub operations in a way that doesn't just like totally flatline our operation and our staff capacity. So yeah, like Alicia said, I've been a food hub operator for over 10 plus years. I have worked at Food Connect Food Hub, where I currently work, for about 8 years. We are a nonprofit wholesale aggregation distribution food hub. We service 3 states. We are organic certified. We have a full high level third party audit and serve lots of large institutional customers. I've been at Food Connect since we were $40,000 in sales, working out of a really small cooler at a farm, to where we are now. And I think we closed out 2025 with like $4.2 million in sales. So there's all sorts of things you learn along that type of growth trajectory, and especially all the different steps of as our regulations have changed, as different things have come up, as the organic regulations changed, as we onboarded as approved vendors with larger customers, just like the stepwise things that happened along the way of that growth. And then before working at Food Connects, I worked at a nonprofit direct to consumer CSA model food hub, and completely different scale. But it's interesting. Like, I worked there when I was in grad school studying food and ag regulations, and my whole capstone project was a regulatory assessment of that food hub. So for whatever reason, I have been drawn to that marriage of food hub operations and regulations for a really long time. And there's a lot of gray area, doesn't really fit that well. Food hubs are not mentioned in regulations. We're an evolving entity. And I'm going to talk more about that. I want to be really transparent with you. I do not know every single thing about FSMA. Like, it's thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of a regulation. And I don't know everything about every single hub on this call. So I've worked one-on-one with quite a few of you. Some of us have been doing more of these collective trainings. So I tried to build some of that stuff into this training. And the goal of this is to be an intro to FSMA with some next steps to get more specific about your facility. And that's really part of what I do a lot with hubs, is help you understand the framework and how to think about your hub within that framework and your compliance. So a little bit of like bringing awareness to the things we don't know, helping you ask questions to yourself about your operation to figure out how you fit into regulations. And just being really straight up, like FSMA is really complex. Food hubs are really complex. So this is like broad strokes. And then the hope is we'll get more into the weeds on each of your own food hub as things progress and you start to work on things. And I have been in the wormhole of FSMA doing research for this. And I don't know, maybe I have more questions than when I started, and that's okay. I have been dreaming about this for the last 2 nights, so I'm so happy to finally be doing this. Okay, so yeah, goals for today. We're going to intro FSMA. We're going to talk a little bit about the background of it, just again, helping you understand the environment. We're going to talk a little bit about the interaction of FSMA and food hubs, define and explore why it's important to your hub, and then talk about what a FSMA status is and why that matters. So broad strokes today, general overview, and then working more specifically on the application to your specific hub over time. So questions, I am going to do my best to save 15 minutes at the end for questions, but also feel free to drop your questions in the chat. If it's applicable and not too wormholey, we'll talk about it in real time. So feel free to drop it in, come off mute, come off your video and ask the question in real time if we can get to it right then. I love actually engaging in real time about these trainings. Okay. So FSMA, it is a federal law and it means the Food Safety Modernization Act, and it's pronounced FSMA. So you'll hear that a lot. You'll hear that thrown around a lot. It is a sweeping regulation that impacts most of the food produced in the US in one way or another. So I often use the language of regulatory framework. What is the regulatory framework that your food hub falls within? And then your regulatory framework informs what your compliance program looks like. It informs what your food safety plan needs to cover. It informs the steps you take to mitigate risk within your operation. It's also just a really fancy way of saying what regulations impact your hub and how. And in the nature of food hubs, it is not a one size fits all answer. It's just not. Like you cannot say all food hubs need to do this or all food hubs have to, have their operation like this. It just isn't the reality that we operate in. Sometimes it's a little easier to parse out. So for example, Food Connects where I work, we're very clearly a wholesale aggregator. We very clearly fit in as a fully regulated facility under FSMA, and we'll talk about that later. But there are lots of hubs out there on this call working with us every day that do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and all these different activities are regulated by different regulations and all fit together to, weave your regulatory framework. So just keep that in mind as we talk about this. You're going to hear me say it again. So there's a web of different regulations that may cover your food hub, and FSMA is highly likely to be one of the main ones. And it's also highly likely that FSMA is not the only regulation that covers your hub, but it's what we're going to focus on today. And in some of the other trainings that we've worked on in the past or that we have planned for the future, kind of pull these different regulatory threads and go into deep dives on different things. So today we're doing a deep dive on FSMA, and it is one of the biggest food related regulations in the regulatory framework. And actually, I just want to know all these pictures that you're going to see are of Food Connects over the years. I don't know, I hadn't done that before, but it is actually really fun just pulling different operational pictures over the years, some of our different storage areas. Most of the pictures are not of our new facility. They're of our old facility and then our medium step facility. And now we have a larger facility that I need to get photos of. But just so you know, these are all Food Connects photos over the years. All of them have little food safety things in them, but we're not going to have time to really talk about them. But feel free to chime in on the chat if you notice little things, kind of little I Spy game. Okay, so next. A little bit of background here on food regulations in general. Maybe this is not interesting to you, but I think it's really important to understand the environment within which some of these things have come forth. Um, and so FSMA is really the largest overhaul in food safety regulations in over 70 years, and it's one of the broadest regulations that has ever been rolled out for food safety. You can follow this timeline a little bit from really when food safety regulations started, and it's it's interesting the background on some of this stuff, and the main theme within them is pretty much every single one of these is a reactive regulation. So there was some huge food safety outbreak, some horrible thing that was found, some big public health outbreak that then in turn reactively triggered the development and implementation of a regulation. And you can see they're all like really specific. So, the low acid canned food probably happened because there was some crazy thing that happened with low acid canned food. Infant formula, that was a huge thing that happened with adulterated infant formula. And seafood, I could go, each one of these has a really interesting background story. But one of the big differences about FSMA is that it's preventative. So it's getting ahead of this stuff, putting more preventative controls into food systems to have a safe supply chain ahead of time and not just reacting to some major outbreak or some really gross thing or some bad actor that was, adulterating food to make more money. I mean, there's still, actually, I won't go there. Anyways, background on it. And this framework about preventative controls is followed in a lot of other countries in their food safety plan and food safety regulations as well. I just see a hand up. I can't tell. Maybe. Okay, I'll keep going. All right. So a little bit about the timeline of FSMA. So regulations, especially this broad, that impact such a broad swath of industry who also have major lobbying sway, take a really long time. And this is, across the board. Our government functions slowly when it does function. So regulations take a really long time. So FSMA was originally passed in 2010. It was signed into law by 2011. And it took until 2015 for, I say most, but really for many to be finalized. And there's literally parts of FSMA that are still not finished. So this really is an evolving framework, which makes it hard to do research around how do I fit into all this, especially because food hubs and our operations are evolving at the same time. So there is some really good stuff out there, and there's some really outdated stuff out there. And it's also very common that regulations don't always keep up with the evolution of the industry that they're regulating. And this is crystal clear when you start talking about FSMA and the interaction with food hubs. Food hubs are not mentioned at all. There is no regulated definition of a food hub. And a lot of the documentation about FSMA focuses on a farm or a food processor or a transporter, or there's different rules that we'll look at. So it just makes it pretty complex. And then another thing I ran into and realized is that a lot of the guidance docs that I have and have used are from like 2017, 2018, 2020. There's very little that I was able to find that's more recent. If anyone on this call has more recent FSMA guidance documents, please send them to me. Like I always learn from the food hubs as well. And I'm collecting a lot of resources. And even some of the stuff I'm finding has language that has since evolved, flow charts that have since evolved, because of course we're learning more as we actually apply and work through these things. And that's pretty common for food hubs and any regulation we're looking at, is that food hubs are not usually specific. I mean, I say usually just to catch myself, but they're not typically mentioned directly in most regulations. Um, so keep that in mind. We'll talk more about that. And then next. So I want to first talk about what FSMA generally does not cover. So pretty clear here, does not cover home gardening and home food preservation. Like hopefully that is never on the table, but just it is very clearly written in FSMA that it does not cover these things. It does not typically cover direct to consumer sales outlets, and we're going to talk more about that. But just if you're a hub that is 100% selling to the end consumer, there's some exemptions there. So FSMA does not tend to cover grocery stores, farmers markets, farm stands, things like that. But there are other regulations that apply to those areas. FSMA does not typically cover areas that are already covered by other regulations. So that's USDA regulated foods. If we were to drop back to this other thing, like low acid canned food are not typically covered under FSMA because they're covered under these other regulations. So there's a patchwork of regulations about like what food's covered by what, which is also fun for you to keep in your mind as a food hub also, that some things are going to be covered by FSMA and some things, if you're handling meat and poultry or other USDA regulated items, that's a whole different framework. And then typically FSMA does not cover nonprofit soup kitchens, food banks, things like that. Okay. So FSMA breaks down into 7 main rules, and I'm going to bring us to a quick little video about what those are. And then as you watch this, try to parse out which of these rules you think might apply the most commonly to food hubs. And then we'll drop, people want to drop it in the chat to see what you think. So I'll take this. And we did practice this ahead of time, so hopefully this works. From our friends at Penn State Extension, they've got some really great resources. Sound working?
The Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA, was signed into law on 2011. This law enables the United States Food and Drug Administration to focus on the prevention of food safety issues, rather than relying primarily on reacting to problems after they occur. There are 7 major rules in FSMA, each one of them designed to make specific actions that must be taken at different points in the global chain to ensure food safety for animal and human food. Let's take a look at the 7 rules. The Produce Safety Rule is the first ever mandatory federal standard for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh produce. The current good manufacturing practices, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls for human food is known as the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. This rule requires food facilities to have a food safety plan in place that includes a hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls to minimize or prevent the identified hazards. The Preventive Controls for Animal Food Rule establishes the current good manufacturing practices and hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls for the production of food for animals. The Rule on Foreign Supplier Verification Programs for importers of food for humans and animals requires that importers perform certain risk-based activities to verify that food imported into the United States has been produced in a manner that meets applicable U.S. safety standards. The Rule on Accredited Third-Party Certification establishes a voluntary program for the accreditation of third-party certification bodies, also known as third-party auditors, to conduct food safety audits and issue certifications of foreign entities and the foods for humans and animals they produce. The Sanitary Transportation of Human and Animal Food Rule. This rule places efforts to protect foods from farm to table by keeping them safe from contamination during transportation. The Rule for Mitigation Strategies to Protect Food Against Intentional Adulteration is aimed at preventing intentional adulteration from acts intended to cause wide-scale harm to public health, including acts of terrorism targeting the food supply. FSMA applies to many domestic and foreign firms producing food for consumption in the United States. Compliance dates for the different rules vary upon the size of a business. There are exemptions to the rules and are based on commodity, risk, size of the facility, sales, and other factors. Your first task is to find out which rule or rules may apply to your entity and start working on your program. Thank you for watching this video. Please follow us at www.
Okay. What do we think here? So if you were thinking about perhaps your facility or food hubs in general, does anyone want to chime in with what you think which rules might apply, which rules we should be aware of? I mean, I know the answers. Okay, we have one person saying transportation.
We have a shy group today.
I know, that's okay. Everyone's probably working, like, I mean, we're food hub operators. Like,
Yeah.
there's 100 things we're doing. Okay, so yes, sanitary transport rule. Rules 1, 2, 5, 6, and 7. Let's see if these match up. Yeah, I mean, the trick answer is they kind of all could in different ways, but the ones that we see most common is, yeah, the produce safety rule, the preventative controls for human food. PCQI is not the acronym for that. PCQI is a training for people under preventative controls. Well, I think we talk about that, but just so you know, like that's nested in. I'm just reading Kyle's answers. We've got accreditation of third-party auditors, and that does play in if you're a food hub getting a third party, but rule would not really fall under on your food hub. So yeah, the ones that typically fall under are produce safety rule, preventative controls rule, and sanitary transport rule. And we've got the intentional adulteration is a fancy way of saying food defense. So adulteration is a regulatory way of saying like someone's intentionally messing with the product, adding something to it, switching stuff out, things like that. So food defense can impact your food hub, especially for larger food hubs, and especially if you have a third party audit. And we're going to talk about that stuff later. Okay, good job, everyone. Thanks for guessing. And honestly, all 7 of those rules could potentially impact a hub, but from what we typically see, it's produce safety, preventative controls, sanitary transport, and sometimes food defense, depending on the size. And we're going to talk about broad strokes of produce safety rule, sanitary transport, and preventative controls as part of our training today. And then as the video said, that is really, your first step of engaging with FSMA is getting clear. And I say that knowing it's not that clear of what rule covers your hub and how. And then when I say being covered, that's general language for saying you're covered by a regulation. In this instance, it's FSMA. And when you're covered by something, it means A, your operation falls under one or more of the regulations issued under FSMA, and B, that your operation should be in compliance with the specific requirements outlined in the rule. That means that's what it means to say covered. I want to make sure we're clear about that. Okay, next. So, whoops, I should have had this slide showing. So yeah, these are the main areas. Produce safety rule, and these are standard, but we're food hubs, we're nuanced. There's totally overlap in all of these statements I'm about to make. So the produce safety rule covers most farms. The preventative controls rule often covers most food hubs. There are food hubs who are in this gray area of like, am I a farm or am I a facility? How am I covered under FSMA? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Sanitary transport rule covers shippers, loaders, carriers and receivers, which also, if you're a food hub who has anything to do with distribution, you're often all four of those in your facility. There's a lot of overlap between these different rules, and your hub might actually fall into multiple categories. And I know that can sound overwhelming, but if you're doing distribution, like for Food Connects, we're doing distribution, but everything we need to do under sanitary transport is also covered on what we need to do under the preventative controls rule. So I'm not necessarily, looking through each of those 1,000-page rules because I know that we're covered by preventative controls rule fully. And so that's part of when we start to parse things out for your particular food hub. If you choose to move forward in that direction, we'll look at all the different activities and we'll talk about that too. Okay. So this brings me to come back to a point. If you've done training with me before, you have seen these definitions, but I always come back to remind us of the very broad definition of what can be considered a food hub. So, take a minute, take a few seconds to just read through these definitions while I take a few sips of water. And so the point I always try to make by sharing this is just remind us that all different types of operations fall within the term of a food hub. I mean, you could even have, and we have multiple food hubs sharing facilities. We have food hubs running out of farm coolers. We have food hubs who are doing, all sorts of different things. So an entity can engage in any of the activities listed here, in any combination, in varying scales, serving different market channels, potentially in multiple states, with various business structures, and be considered a food hub. So these are all variables of your operation to start to get clear on when you talk about being a food hub. Because it's really important that you can define like what kind of food hub are you. And it's important anyways, as the food hub landscape evolves. It's especially important when you're comparing against regulations, but there's a lot of interest in food hubs right now. There's a lot of funding going to food hubs, and you have to be able to define what service your food hub is offering. There's also a lot of chatter in some of the regulatory spaces that I'm in about how there isn't a regulated definition of what constitutes a food hub. And, part of my brain really would love for there to be a regulated definition because it would make some things a lot easier. And a really big part of my brain is averse to that because food hubs typically exist in response to a specific need in your localized community that isn't otherwise being met. And that's part of the beauty. That's part of what makes each food hub so different. And that's really important. And we don't want to lose that by having to fit into this really small regulated definition. So what I recommend, and for anyone I do one-on-one technical assistance with, we spend time getting really clear about what type of food hub you are. For example, maybe you heard when I introduced Food Connects, right? Like we are a nonprofit, wholesale, aggregation, distribution food hub. I know that can, depending on how many activities we have, that can be a really long introduction, but it helps. It helps people understand what services you're offering. It helps funders understand the food hub landscape. And it's just something to really consider as you continue to build your narrative around your organization or your operation. So this slide here just identifies some of the most common variables about your operation that help weave your regulatory framework. So what is your business structure? A lot of food hubs are nonprofits. Plenty of them are not. And there's all sorts of business structures that trigger different things. What activities are you engaged in? So that's what we just talked about. Are you a distributor? Are you co-packing? Are you doing direct home delivery? Things like that. And then the scale of each activity, typically measured in sales numbers. And I know that doesn't fit for everyone, especially if you're doing charitable food giving, but Your sales numbers is a pretty important thing to be looking at in terms of different thresholds of regulations. And we're going to look at that a little bit closer later. What market channel do you sell to? And these are not the only market channels, but especially for FSMA, are you doing direct to consumer? Meaning, are you directly selling to the person eating the food? Or are you selling to a wholesale market channel? There's a big spectrum of what wholesale markets can mean. But if you boil it down, it's like, are you selling to someone who is further processing this or further serving it or further selling it? So just keep that in mind. Your supply chain, who are you selling from? That's something that we're going to talk more about. And actually, we have a whole training, I think it's in February, about your supply chain program. And then your service area. So whether or not you cross state lines or you buy and sell. So if you cross state lines in transportation or if you're buying and selling across state lines, not so important in FSMA, but definitely important in some other regulations, especially state-based licensing. So variables to start to get clarity around for your operation. Okay. So FSMA is a big web, food hubs are a big web, and we're going to start to overlay these webs together, weave it together, and try to understand how FSMA interacts with your operation. So one way I like to think about FSMA is that it's activities based, right? So we just talked about all these different activities. Different activities trigger different rules under FSMA. It is not necessarily ownership or business based. And I'm talking about your actual business structure. And then I'm also meaning ownership of the product. So you might be, say you are a food hub that only provides third-party freight, or there's other options where you might technically never actually own that product, but the activities you're engaging in are triggering different parts of this regulation. And that's, again, specific to FSMA. There are plenty of regulations and licenses out there that are ownership based. But to think about FSMA as activities based is going to really help you continue working through this. FSMA regulations are tiered. So regardless of what rule we're looking at under those 7 rules of FSMA, there typically are different tiers of exemptions before you are fully regulated. Those exemptions are tied to, again, activities, the market, direct to consumer versus wholesale, and then your sales numbers. And we're going to look at some of those specifics later on too. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about the activities your food hub engages in a lot, but so this really comes down to what activities do you engage in, what kind of food hub are you, who are you selling to, and that all informs what we call your FSMA status. And it's like, how are you regulated under FSMA? That is your FSMA status. Food Connects, for example, we are fully regulated under the preventative controls rule. And we've been a fully regulated facility for, gosh, I don't know, 3 or 4 years now. And knowing that is really helpful for us. And yeah, so we're not going to define everyone's FSMA status by the end of this training, unfortunately, but we're going to have a lot more familiarity around what that even means and how to start thinking about it. So we're going to start moving through a few different rules of FSMA, and I'm going to identify some of the more common FSMA statuses. But what I want to be clear about is this is not an exhaustive list. There are lots of nuances, lots of different definitions and exemptions and ways your operation can be defined under FSMA. So the ones I'm going to talk specifically about are the ones I see most commonly applied to food hubs. But if you don't see yourself in these categories, that's okay. And we can figure that out. So, okay. So this was a report I was reading, a little outdated, but I still really like this. Sorry, my dog is really scared of the snow falling off the roof and is being a little distracting right now. So, given the variation in food hub operations and the individual characteristics of each business, the question of coverage must be assessed on a case-by-case basis. So again, just saying in a more jargony way what I just said, that this does not apply to all. We're going to look at each thing individually. But what I do see the most common are food hubs are exempt under the retail food establishment. We're going to look at that later. But that basically means majority of your sales are direct to consumer. You are still regulated under other regulations. We have FSMA preventative controls rule as a food facility. That's where most food hubs fall. We have FSMA produce safety rule as a secondary activities farm. We're going to look at that a little bit closer. And then we've got FSMA sanitary transportation rule for freight providers and people that are doing heavily focused on transport and maybe don't own the product or don't have warehouses, things like that. And just to be clear about what an exemption means, exemption is a regulatory way of saying you don't have to comply with all or with certain parts of a regulation. And usually any type of regulation is going to have a section of it that outlines specific exemptions. So it's very common to have exemptions in a regulation. And then, oh yeah, so one other thing I want to talk about before we go into the more specifics of each rule, because we might like get down some wormholes and run out of time, is I want to be really clear that if you are a food hub who maybe is engaging with larger customers, maybe you're a food hub who is required to have a third-party audit, that those things don't always match up. So FSMA is kind of the baseline of things you should be doing. It is extremely common for a customer contract to have stricter requirements than a FSMA regulation. And it is almost always this typical for a third-party audit to have a little bit stricter. I mean, depending on the audit, some can be way, way, way stricter than FSMA. And they don't care, if you are an exempt or a qualified exempt under FSMA, which means you don't have to comply with everything, and you are trying to onboard with a large customer and you're eyeing a third-party audit, you kind of just need to start thinking about being a fully regulated entity, because any audit is going to be against the full scope of FSMA. It is not going, so it's like, yeah, maybe you're qualified exempt, but you want to sell to this customer and they require this. Just putting on your radar that having that gap between the two is very, very common. And it's one of those things also that does make sense, because these are larger customers. They have a higher risk in their supply chain. They're serving a lot of people. They have to know that you are providing safe food into their supply chain. And that's typically where these stricter contracts and third-party audits come from. And I want to just highlight the FSMA status of your growers, which is another area where like different FSMA statuses may collide, for lack of a better word. And again, we're going to talk a lot more about your supply chain in a future training, but just know, like, if you are a fully regulated entity or you are doing a third-party audit and you're working with growers that are, maybe they're exempt, maybe they're partially exempt, for you to have your supply chain meet your FSMA requirements, that might trickle down to them of having to perhaps have more defined systems than they otherwise would have to. So we're not going to go down that wormhole too much, but I just wanted to bring that up. Third-party audits is its whole own training, and vendor onboarding, supply chain is its whole own training. And as Alicia said, we do have that scheduled for February 17th for supply chain under FSMA. Okay, so pin in this topic. We will talk more about it next. So the first thing I want to highlight is this retail food establishment exemption. And it's not specifically called this under the produce safety rule, but there are similar exemptions for very small or direct to consumer entities. So under the retail food establishment, you are selling to the end consumer, right? So you are the one selling to the person eating the food, period. If you are selling to an intermediate, like we mentioned before, where the food is further processed or it's sold again, that is not considered a direct to consumer outlet. So start thinking about that for your market channels. And then the next question you ask is you say, yeah, I am. Okay. So then the tier really is 50.1% of the monetary value of your sales of food products to direct to consumer outlets. And if you can answer yes to that, then you are highly likely exempt from FSMA. Okay, but and that typically includes farm stands, farmers markets, CSAs, things like that. Or you are a farmers market, you are a CSA. If you're a food hub selling to a retail farm store, that is an intermediate step. But if you are a food hub that is running a farmer's market, like those, like what I'm saying about the nuances between our activities. And there's lots of food hubs that manage farmers markets. And there's lots of food hubs that sell to farmers markets, or, maybe less of that, but like there's lots of hubs that perhaps run a farm stand. And then there's lots of hubs like us, we sell to farm stands. So, thinking about that step of the supply chain, which step are you in the supply chain? And many food hubs have a mixture of this, right? A lot of food hubs start as a direct to consumer model. And then you start adding your wholesale accounts. You start eyeing those institutional markets. This is a really important threshold number to stay aware of as your operation is evolving. And also to maintain your business status. So as long as your direct to consumer sales are 50.1% of your total sales, then you most likely maintain this food retail establishment exemption. But say you're growing really fast, and this happens, I've talked to food hubs on this call that I know you're targeting wholesale growth, and I know you're targeting access to institutional markets. So this is really important for you to be aware of. As that percentage ratio starts to change, so does your business status, so does your compliance program, so do your responsibilities within the supply chain. And sometimes you might say, hey, like, we're not ready for that. We're actually not going to do this because we like being exempt. We're a really small operation. We're not ready for some of these higher level regulations. And that's such great information for you to know as you look at the growth, or you're planning sales for the next year, or you're trying to hook that really big institutional customer. That might totally flip your sales numbers. And it's not good, it's not bad, it's just information and data for you to be aware of as you make choices and as you write grants and as you try to onboard new customers. And to be frank, like, as you do engage in wholesale markets, you need to have more awareness about your food safety. Food hubs have for a really long time flown under the radar with compliance because of how small we've been. And that has its benefits, but it's also changing. I don't think food hubs are really under the radar anymore. We're definitely being asked to comply with a lot of standard regulations, a lot of standard contracts that we see given to growers or distributors, things like that. And then that kind of leads into my next point that I just want to drop in to perhaps our fully exempt hubs, that just because you're direct to consumer and just because you're exempt from FSMA, it's definitely not you still are responsible for having a safe operation, safe food handling, temperature controls, maintaining a sanitary environment, but it's less formal. Like maybe you don't have, you have a small operation, you have a team of two, someone's sweeping every week. It's great to have records, but you don't necessarily have to. But it's not just like a hall pass to have like a free for all of unsafe things. I'm not saying anyone does that, but just keep that in mind, that it's like, okay, I'm exempt and I still am responsible for providing safe food to the folks that I'm serving in my community. And again, just the reminder that if you are exempt from FSMA, it's highly likely that there's other state and municipal regulations. So, most hubs have a relationship with your health department, things like that, and they might have their own state specific, I mean, not might, they do. They have their own state specific requirements, and some state health departments have inspections, things like that. Very different by state. Okay, take a sip of water. Oh, wow. Okay, I'm going to start speed talking even more than I have been. We're running out of time. Okay. So sanitary transport rule, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Honestly, this is one of the more clear parts of FSMA. And I do link to the regulation here. So if you are someone that likes to go directly to the regulation and look at things, I try to always go to the statute. So sanitary transport rule, it really governs how the food is moved. It is governing transportation. The standard language, it is there to ensure that food is not contaminated, adulterated, or temperature abuse during transport, whether by truck, rail, or ship. I have yet to work with a food hub who is using rail or ship. Well, I know there are some hubs in Alaska that are doing stuff by boat. So I think most of us probably fall by truck. Drop in the chat if you're doing anything different, though. Super interested in that. And like I said earlier, this covers shippers, loaders, carriers. There are standard definitions of what each of those terms mean. But essentially, if you're a hub doing distribution, you're highly likely doing all those roles just as part of your regular operation. You're loading trucks, you're driving trucks, you're receiving products. The main risks covered under this part of the rule are temperature abuse, aka your cold chain, cross-contamination, and then allergen, chemical, and physical contamination. And if you've ever written a HACCP plan, those are the three main categories of things you're controlling for in each step of your HACCP plan. This applies really, actually, again, it's like one of the clearer parts. The scope of this is pretty narrow. It's loading, transit, and unloading. It's not really about storage, not about processing. It's pretty specific to transport. And if you are a hub that only provides freight, this is really where you're going to spend the most time. Technically, it's a separate rule from FSMA preventative controls rule, but there's a ton of overlap when you look. So yeah, we'll talk about that. But the PCR is based on current good manufacturing practices, CGMPs, which also covers loading, transit, unloading. It also covers your distribution actions. Okay, next, the produce safety rule. So this starts to get more nuanced. Again, I've linked to the statute, and produce safety rule essentially covers farms, all farms. Farms are defined as entities that grow, harvest, pack, and or hold fresh produce in one general location under one general management. And this seems to be a very clear, straightforward definition, but it's not, right? Like, we know that all of these things can mean lots of things. And like, what does one general location mean? I mean, so they do have stuff defined, and there are additional nuances around on-farm processing and on-farm packing that I'm going to identify in a few slides from now. And I know we've got a lot of hubs that are, on-farm aggregators or started as farms and still are owned by farms or perhaps working out of farms, things like that. And then there's the same type of exemptions apply under FSMA PCR. There's average annual produce sale exemptions. And then there's a couple other exemptions, but these are the two main ones that I see. And then only grow produce that is rarely eaten raw. So that is federally defined, believe it or not, all defined by the FDA. But just think of it like as you don't typically eat dried beans raw. We're not typically eating potatoes raw. I mean, there's lots of produce that's defined as commonly eaten raw and rarely eaten raw. So I'm going down the wormhole. We don't need to go there right now. And and you might be a food hub that is so clearly not regulated under the produce safety rule. But again, it's important to have awareness of it because this informs a lot of your supply chain. So like you aren't covered by a produce safety rule, but it's likely that the growers you work with are. So you want to be aware of it as you start to work on your supply chain program. Okay. So one status that I see a lot under the FSMA produce safety rule for food hubs is the status of a secondary activities farm. I'm not going to go into super detail of each of these FSMA statuses. I'm just highlighting ones that I see. And if you are a hub that is an on-farm aggregator, then you might want to check out some of these FSMA statuses. We're going to send you so many amazing flowcharts. You're going to be so excited about it. But this might be something to be aware of if this definition here sounds like it might apply to you. So it basically is, you know, you're a farm, you're doing all the regular farm things, and you have a couple other things going on there. And perhaps you're doing stuff at a different location than your main farm location. And yeah, a lot of food hubs started out as grower-owned cooperative, on-farm aggregators, even food connects. We're the classic tale of produce growers forming their own distribution network. We started as a farmer-owned cooperative, distributing produce and packing out on one of our main farms. And even when I started at Food Connects, our operations were still out of a cooler on that farm, while the other half of our organization and our non-produce inventory was stored in a different location. So it's super common story, and it can be like this. Are we FSMA PSR? Are we FSMA preventative controls rule? Are we a farm or are we a facility? And there's a big spectrum in between those two things that I find is not that clearly defined for all the different ways food hubs and farms have evolved together. So we're working on that, trying to get more clarity. This is a great flow chart that I have linked here that is actually from our friends here, from University of California Extension and some other partners. This is a condensed version, but it's my favorite flow chart. And something I love about this is at the end of it, it actually has some examples of what a secondary activities farm could look like and helps you think through that. So you're going to be given this resource. I really highly encourage you to take a pass through this. This is condensed to just include the flow chart, and I can explain more about that later. But okay, back to this. And then another consideration under the produce safety rule that I see applied to food hubs is a farm mix type facility. So it's still the same thing. It's a farm doing all the farm things, and maybe they're doing some light processing. Maybe they're doing some off-farm distribution. They are doing things that may trigger part of the preventative controls rule. So there's different types of, like, coming back to those sales numbers. Okay, like how much of what you're doing is produce versus how much of what you're doing is other items versus what type of processing are you doing? There's like a whole spectrum of lightly processed or minimally different types of processing. And as you get into higher risk levels of that, it's going to start to trigger the preventative controls rule. Often mixed type farms fall into what's called dual regulatory oversight, which just means it's like a fancy way of saying some of your actions are covered by the produce safety rule and some of your actions are covered by the preventative controls rule. And yes, it can stink to be regulated by both, but there's totally precedent for this and systems we can talk through and ways to make it work. Okay. So now we're going to get to the preventative controls rule. And this is really where we see the bulk of food hubs falling into. Statute is linked. It's called the it's technically called the Preventative Controls for Human Foods Rule, but often in industry language, you'll see Preventative Controls Rule. So it'll be shortened and the acronym will be shortened. But there's totally different guidance docs, especially earlier ones that say the whole rule. So if you see these used interchangeably, just know that it's, I can't say for sure, but that it is highly likely pointing to the same thing. So preventative controls rules covers facilities. And these are facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold human food for US consumption. So many food hubs are considered facilities, and they are therefore regulated in some way under the preventative controls rule, which also requires FDA registration. And just like we talked about, there are tiered exemptions under preventative controls. And when we say facility, this really covers your standard aggregation distribution, your manufacturers, your processors, your co-packers, your commercial kitchens, things that are in a facility, right? And there's a whole spectrum of that. And like I said, I know there's gray area between farm and facility. You see I highlighted this term hold, or bolded the term hold in this definition. And this is actually where a lot of food hubs, like this term hold, is actually what encompasses a lot of food hubs. So this is the technical definition of holding for FSMA under the SDA. I've bolded some of the main phrases here. So storage of food, activities performed for the distribution of food, including breaking down pallets. So if you are touching cases, breaking down pallets, things like that, you are holding food. And then holding facilities could include warehouses, cold storage facilities, and other items here. But so this is really where, when we dig into the activities that we're doing, this term holding tends to loop in a lot of food hubs. And it's actually in other regulations too. The term hold. All right. So the two main areas we work the most with under the preventative controls rule, again, this is not all the exemptions that exist under preventative controls, but these are the two that I see most often working with hubs, is a fully regulated facility. If you really boil it down, a fully regulated, you become a fully regulated facility when your sales go above, your average sales over 3 years go above 1 million. There's a couple other things that we'll look at in this flow chart, but if you want the easy answer, once you go above 1 million in sales, your average sales for 3 years, you're highly likely to be a fully regulated facility. And then qualified exempt facility is kind of the tier below fully regulated. And many food hubs fall within this FSMA status. So qualified facility under the preventative controls rule. There's a couple things that play into that definition. But again, if we're boiling it down, you have less than 1 million in sales over a 3-year average. And a qualified exempt, wow, sorry, I'm starting to get tongue-tied. You are partially covered. You need to follow current good manufacturing practices. You need to register with the FDA, and you submit that exemption with the FDA, and you do this through an FDA portal. And it's actually, you submit your qualified exempt information in the same place where you register for your FDA number. And we've done some training around FDA numbers, and I do have that information if you have questions about that. This is another number another sales threshold to be super aware of as your food hub evolves, because a lot happens. Like when that average number of sales over 3 years ticks over 1 million, you go to a new tier of FSMA. So it's kind of like we talked about with the direct to consumer versus wholesale, that 50.1, be really aware of your sales growth. And you can, as you're budgeting for the next year, take this into consideration and say like, okay, like if our sales actually come in at what, whatever number you have budgeted for your sales, look at that against your last two numbers of sales and just have awareness around how close you are to this threshold, this FSMA threshold. It doesn't have to be reactive. If you know that you're quickly growing and you're targeting this big sales job and you're onboarding with your big university in town and they're going to be, doing $500,000 in sales per year, like you can plan for this. You can know like 2 to 3 years out, we're going to be fully regulated. So, you might say, hey, we're growing anyways. We're just going to start building our compliance program out as a fully regulated facility because we know in 2 or 3 years we're going to be fully regulated. That's what happened at Food Connects. We had a lot of support from Vermont Law School over the years too. So they to us were like, hey, keep an eye on this. And so we really knew like 2 years out, we knew when we were going to become fully regulated. And so a lot of our systems, especially our supply chain program, we built out knowing it needed to comply with the full regulation versus riding that qualified exemption until the very bitter end of it. So yeah, and it's another important thing to think about. So it's not just your operation, but compliance work and food safety systems, it takes staff capacity and admin help. And I mean, like build it into your budget, build it into your staffing, you're going to have to buy probably like a lot of miscellaneous supplies, like, color coded brooms and steel tables and things like that. So Kristen just asked, if we have the retail food establishment exemption, do we not need to comply with PCR or sanitary transport rule, even if we do more than 1 million sales or each of those separate things? So there is a part in the flow chart about that, Kristen, about like who you're selling to as you get to these larger numbers, and we could look at that separately. But yeah. But it also is that question to ask yourself that if you're doing over 1 million in 3 years of sales and you're doing all direct to consumer, that's still a lot of food going out, right? So maybe you don't need to have everything in place under FSMA, but you probably should still have like pretty good food safety systems because that's a lot of food that you're moving. And sanitary transport rule, I'd have to look at more to see how that interacts. But we can, and I know you and we're talking about some stuff already, so we can look at this. When I do technical assistance with hubs directly, the first thing we work through together is your FSMA status, with support from lots of lovely flow charts out there. Yes, my favorite flow chart. And the one that Alicia shared here is the full one. So I condensed it. So the one Alicia shared is right here. And this is actually a guidance document that was made specifically for your supplier verification requirements, which again, we're going to talk about. But it's just such a good flow chart for general use that I send it out all the time for general use, totally unrelated to it's all related, but to just talk about FSMA in general and not just about your supply chain. Yeah. There's not. So this document is just about FSMA, and it's really just about preventative controls too. So it's a very narrow scope. There's different things we'll send you that have different information, but there aren't nothing state specific in this. That's kind of a whole different framework and different conversation. Um, all right. And then, yeah, Kristen, we would essentially run through this and go through some questions. Um, and so you can see, even just scrolling through this, we've talked about all these yellow boxes are different types of exemptions, and we haven't talked about, most of them, just the ones I see the most common. Um, all right. Next thing here. Yeah, so these are some of the helpful flowcharts that I like to send out. So you've already seen my favorite flowchart. And then these are some pretty clever, these are some pretty clever, more interactive ones that I saw, especially if you're someone who's kind of navigating that. Am I a farm? Am I a facility? Am I both? Like where's the overlap and where do I shift from one to the other? I found some pretty good interactive um, kind of like cascading logic ones that we'll send out. I just have this dream to make like this really interactive, like, like essentially like a choose your own adventure, but like you're choosing your FSMA status and it like takes you to all the different places. These ones are close. And then this one was pretty good too, through UNH. And this takes you through like, I was clicking around a bunch to try to test out different things, and I was pretty, I liked it. So I would encourage you to play around with this. You could say, yes, I do. And it's going to take you, it just, all these cascading things about different um, steps, and then a lot of information in here about what's what. So we come back here to this, secondary activities farm, and how does that fit in? I want more information, things like that. Yeah, so this will all be a follow-up. We're going to send you all this information. We're going to send you, you'll have access to this recording. You'll have access to the PowerPoint. It's all going to be available. And I actually think that's my last slide. And wow, it is 4:15 on the dot.